Okay, so we're going to review from 1450 to 1750 today and talk about the main developments and look at possible connections that would help you understand the content in terms of what possible essays might be as well. So remember, before this time period, 1200 to 1450, it's the rise of, or the spread of Islam. You have China spreading its influence. You have the Mongols. You have all these Silk Roads, trans-Saharan trade routes, and you have Indian Ocean trade. And it's very important to understand the big ideas or big events that happen in each of these time periods, because that's the most common way students miss multiple choice questions and also don't get points on the essays. The multiple choice questions have to have answers that have some level of plausibility but still have to be wrong. So most of the time they'll sound good because they're true, but they don't exist within the time period that you're dealing with. For example, if there was a question about what event between 1450 and 1750 increased trade the most, and one of them was the rise of the Mongol Empire, well, that's true of the previous time period, but not here. So if you don't have the big events or the big developments anchored on the timeline, you might think, well, that's true. Well, it is, but not for this time period. So that's the easiest way to write the wrong answers on the multiple choice. And if you had to write an essay about that and you brought up the Mongols, but the dates were 1450 on, it wouldn't count for anything. So it's important that we do these timelines, that we look at the big things that we have here. So in a nutshell, what we have here is an age of discovery, an exploration, and colonization. And then when we get to 1750, the next time period, all those places get independence. And those are the 13 North American colonies. It's Mexico and Latin America. There's the French Revolution. Haiti gets its independence in the Caribbean. But then a whole new wave of imperialism starts all over again between 1750 and 1900. And this one is based on the needs of the Industrial Revolution. This one's about markets, finding people to sell to, and getting raw materials that used to not be really worth anything until machines were invented that can turn them very quickly into valuable things. So you have like a cycle: colonization, independence, then a new wave of colonization, and then those places like Africa and India, they get their independence after World War II. So it's a good way to think of the changes and continuities and the main developments. So to begin with, right around 1450, you have two very important events. One of them is right on time. It's 1453. In 1453, you have the fall of the city of Constantinople. And the fall of the city is very important because Europeans used to trade with merchants in the East by goods that passed through there. Constantinople is part of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire collapsed in 1453 when the Ottomans came in and they took the city. And that's very important because now it really bothered Europeans that to trade now and get all those cool things that they were first exposed to during the Crusades, they had to buy them through the Muslim middlemen now. Constantinople will later be named Istanbul, and it's part of the Ottoman Empire now. And it really bothered Christians in Western Europe to have to do trade through there. So they're going to start to look for different routes. Here you have Columbus and Vasco da Gama and many others, but those are the two important ones. So the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is pretty important. The other major thing, and it was a process, but it kind of culminated around this time period, is the unification of Iberia. And Iberia is that most western part of Europe that today is Spain and Portugal. And they became two of the newest kingdoms. And the unification of Spain actually, Ferdinand and Isabella were married, but this is called the reconquest of Spain because they're conquering it back from Muslims. That actually culminates in the year 1492 when they defeat the last Muslim kingdom. And they're going to take that whole process of conquest, and after 1492, they're going to aim it at the Americas and do the same thing there. So those are two things that are very important here, and they're related as well. So you have all these things coming in to Europe new navigational technologies. You have Spain and Portugal, brand new nations that want to prove something. They want to excel and catch up with the big boys, you might say, like the British, like the English and the French and the Dutch. And so they want to get a jump on things. So they really start exploring. They're right there, kind of jutted out into the Atlantic Ocean anyway. And so they begin to take these new technologies, the astrolabe and so forth, and they begin to go exploring. Remember, they had the means to do that with these tools, but they had the motive to get around the Muslims that are now there where Constantinople used to be. And so in this process, they're going to go two different ways. And I made a video on maritime empires that will give you more details about this, but basically what you have in the 1490s is Europeans going this direction, and that's Columbus, and then they went this direction, and that means around Africa, and that is Vasco da Gama. So Columbus goes obviously to the west, Vasco da Gama goes to the east, and here's a great possible essay topic comparing European imperialism in the Americas with European imperialism in the Indian Ocean following the route of da Gama, because they're absolutely different. The Europeans, this is at first Portugal, then Spain, and then later the British and the Dutch. When they get into the Indian Ocean, remember they have these big ambitions to take over the whole region, but they can't. Those kingdoms are still pretty powerful, and they already have a system of trade. So what the Europeans end up doing is just adding to the volume of trade. And the DBQ you did recently may have, I think it dealt with that. So the Portuguese and then the Spanish just end up adding to the volume of trade, and they kind of have to play by the rules that were there. They attempt to take these kingdoms, but they're too strong. The Mughals are too strong. China's strong and robust, and there's not really much of a dent on Africa on the east coast. There's not a lot of colonization. Remember, the original plan of the Europeans is just to conquer the ports and create a trading post empire where they just tax the things that pass through those ports and kind of leech in a parasitical way off of the wealth that's being exchanged there. But there's no big cultural impact in the Indian Ocean in this time period. Now, if we jump to the next time period, this is when India does cave in, China caves in after the Opium Wars, and there's a great scramble for Africa. That's all over there. But at this point, the Europeans go in there and end up just becoming merchants like everybody else. The Europeans that followed the heels of Columbus to the New World, completely different experience. There's absolute domination and conquest of the Americas. So at first the Portuguese, but then the Spanish are of course the big ones that come in, and they colonize over here. So I'm going to break down this again and do a really quick comparison. So you have a comparison here of the two directions, Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Now I want to do a comparison of the different areas of the New World, or the Americas, that were colonized. So over here, first of all, you have the South America, and this is colonized by the Iberians. And of course, I mean by Iberians, I mean the Spanish and the Portuguese. Mainly Spain here. Portugal had Brazil, and most of the things I'm going to say about Spain are also true of Brazil. But you have this colonization, and then you have North America, which was colonized by the British, or England. I'm just going to go with England here. Of course, the French are there too, but these two make a really tight contrast. If you think about it for a second, when the Spanish came over to Iberia, they're going to use the same practice that they used for the reconquest of Iberia in Spain. They're going to send over conquistadors, all right, conquerors, and they're going to allow them to enslave people that they take over, claim the land for Spain, and then use it for their own personal wealth. So you have you have the elites, the upper class, you know, they kind of came from the old class of knights. And they're going to come over here and they're going to set up systems of labor like encomienda, that's explained in the video, haciendas, and then they also adapt the mita system. And the mita system is really like conquered people pay tribute in the form of labor, and you should associate that with what's going on in the silver mines in the colonies of Mexico and Bolivia and so forth. So you should know those three types of labor. Later, it becomes the plantation system when sugar and then later cotton are brought over. So that is what you have here in Iberia. And because it's mainly men coming over, they take wives and they have children with the indigenous people and with the slaves that they bring over. And you end up with a race-based class system that starts at the very top with peninsulares, who are Europeans, people who live in Europe and Spain on the peninsula, and they're here just to administrate for the king. Then you have Creoles, who are usually, they're Spaniards or Portuguese if they're in Brazil, and they come over here. They kind of made the Americas their home. And then you have different mixes of these races all the way down to indigenous and slaves that have no rights whatsoever. So the closer you are to being a pure European and even still have a home over there, the higher you are up in this hierarchy. The king, this land was claimed for the king, and the king micromanaged that land as best he could from across the ocean by using people called viceroys. Viceroys were sent to rule on behalf of the king. And they were obviously people the king trusted very much. They would come over and they'd rule. They did decisions that would please the king. And the king took 20% of all the profit. So what was coming in from the sugar, and that later becomes molasses and rum, the silver that comes up, the king is taking 20% of that and kind of managing things the best that they can. So you have that's the nature of things here. It's conquest, enslaving the people, intermarrying with them, creating a new race-based system that really helped them rule, and the king trying to control as much as possible. What you have here is something quite different. From England come, there are some commercial enterprises, but a lot of the people who come from England to settle in the Americas are outcasts. They're people who they're not the elites, they're people who disagree with the way religion is going, and they want to come over and create their own little perfect little religious communities, something they cannot do in England. That's what the Pilgrims were coming over for, and the Puritans came over for that. In other words, they brought their whole families. They were settler colonies. Remember, settler colonies, like the French in Algeria, the settler colonies were people who came over to live and to make a place their new home. And this is for religious reasons. And what happens is, because it wasn't just some adventurer men coming over, because families came over, they created almost a secluded society and had very limited contact with the indigenous people. I mean, there was some, but as their colonies grew, they just kind of pushed those people back. And a lot of historians see the beginning of segregation, or the mindset of segregation, separation by races, in that kind of strategy there, with settler colonies pushing indigenous people out, and that continued and continued until now indigenous people were sent way out to reservations in some of the worst land in the United States. So there's a process there. However, one difference here is that the colonies of North America basically ruled themselves. You'll learn this when you take U.S. history. There's something called salutary neglect. That means they were part of the king's emperor, but the king just didn't bother with it. They ran themselves. They elected their own representatives to govern themselves, and they ran most of their economic affairs. There were taxes on them. It really wasn't worth it for the king to collect them. So the irony here is that South America was founded by elites, but controlled and managed by the king. North America was founded by kind of the dregs of society, or the outcasts, but they quickly learned how to rule themselves and to manage their own economic affairs, which means over here, after 1750, when these areas get their independence, South America has no practice whatsoever of self-governing. And they have very little affairs or very little experience managing economic affairs. And they struggle with independence a great deal. They just don't have the practice. Whereas North America is just simply want to continue their legacy of self-rule. And they've already been running their own economic affairs. So this place that was started by kind of the lower class people of England, they fared better. And that's kind of an ironic development there. So this is what you have here. And these colonies, South America, North America, Brazil, Spain, the French are here too, but the French are after, they still want to get across North America and still get to China. The French made their money off of the fur trade, and that will play into U.S. history that you'll learn about next year. So these colonies just continued through the rest of this time period, and this next time period starts off with a bang, 1776, the 13 colonies rebel, then the French will have a revolution, Haiti will break free, all the stuff that we'll talk about on Wednesday when we timeline that time period goes on here. This is all in the context of maritime empires, all right? And I kind of glossed right over a whole bunch of topic pages. Maritime empires, new technologies, how they administrated their colonies, how they ruled them. And there's another, I think it's 4.6, that topic is about resistance to colonial rule. And most of that is really pertinent to Unit 3, which is land-based empires, which we'll look at in just a second. But there's one example here of resistance to colonial rule, and that is the slaves that escape plantations. Right? Plantations began in Brazil with the Portuguese, and sugar was the cash crop. A lot of them escaped, some of them escaped, and they fled and went to the highlands of the northern part of South America, where they formed communities up in the hills, where they were kind of out of reach. And those communities were called maroon communities, and some of them are still there today. They have their own, they have their own communities. They carried on a lot of their traditions, and they just escaped the whole mess of slavery. That is a form of resistance, and that satisfies topic 4.6. All right? There are things that we could look at on the land-based empires that do as well. So I'm just going to, there's maritime empires. That is topic, or Unit 4, okay? Now what I want to do is just briefly sketch Unit 3, and I taught 4 first and then I taught 3. It just made more sense historically. Unit 3 has only really 3 topic pages. Empires expand, empires use religion, and how empires were administrated. And basically what you should do here is look at the required land-based empires. In the topic page, in the historical development, it named empires, and if they name them, if they call them out by name in the blue box called historical developments, it means you're required to know them. If they're in illustrated examples, you can kind of choose which one. So the ones you have to know are the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, and the Manchu, which is the ruling people in China. They're called the Qing dynasty. So these are land-based empires. I also teach the Russian Empire, and although there won't be a multiple choice question on the test that requires you to know anything about Russia, if you use any of the information about Russia when you write an essay, it counts for you. So that's not a bad thing to know. So the story of these land-based empires over here really begins with the fall of the Mongol Khanates. Remember, the Mongols come over here and they take over everybody. They take over China. They take over Russia. They take over northern India. They take over, the Ilkhanate takes over where the Abbasids used to be. Well, they all crash before this time period. And now you have land-based empires being restored. All right? You have the Russians break free from Mongol rule, and they begin to expand under Ivan III and Ivan IV, and then Peter the Great does the most work. It's interesting because in the illustrative examples in 4.6 for examples of resistance, they use the Cossacks in Russia. So you can pull information from the Russian Empire, but since they're not listed as a required one, let me just kind of give you in a nutshell the ones that they do list. All right, 2 of them have a major similarity because they are invaders from the outside who come in. They have a different either religion or ethnicity than the conquered people, and they constitute a minority in these massive empires. They're ruling over people who are much different from them. And those two empires are the Mughals and the Manchus. All right? Mughals are Mongols who converted to Islam and took over India, mainly the northern part of India. And so they're monotheist. They're ruling a massive Hindu majority. And they have to negotiate that very carefully because Islam says all your gods aren't true. And, they have to rule these people. And we looked at Akbar as a great example of how that worked out. And he practiced tolerance. He brought in scholars from Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Confucius and Buddhism, and he allowed them open, free discussion to do that. So there was a time under Akbar where you had kind of the peaceful coexistence. And he even married Hindu princesses to kind of appease the Hindu subjects. So that was successful. And that is the nature of the Mughals. They did painting and we're going to see art in here and how empires legitimize their rule. Many of them use art. The Mughals and the Ottomans use what's called miniature painting. They're small paintings, but they show great things that the leader did, like famous victories. So you can imagine the Ottomans had many portraits of the fall of Constantinople. That was a reminder. Look how great we are. Look what we did. The Mughals had miniatures too of famous battles, and also they drew pictures of genealogies. Who descended from whom and from whom and from whom. And sometimes they weren't always real genealogies, but they were meant to show that the leader followed this long line of powerful people that might even go way back to some, people who are mentioned in the Bible and the Quran. There are a lot of the same people in the Bible and in the Quran. So the Mughals, being Muslim, would want to do that. So you have painting used to prop up themselves and to legitimize their power. Now the Ottomans, remember, it begins in 1453 here when they really expand. The Ottomans take over a portion of the world that used to be the Byzantine Empire, so they bring in a great deal of Christians. What you should know here is the Devshirme system of, it's called the gathering, where they would take sons from Christian families, bring them up in Islam away from their families, turn them into the military, and they became the Janissaries. So that was one method that the Ottomans used. They created Janissaries who were given the firearms. And the reason they did that is because not knowing who their families were made them completely loyal and dependent on the state, on the government. They had no family to fall back on. So that meant, it secured their loyalty. So they're the ones trusted with new firearms. You should also know the millet system, M-I-L-L-E-T, that the Ottomans came up with, and that was how to deal with Christians and Jews in their empire. Other monotheistic faiths. It was kind of related to Islam. Not polytheists, by the way, which they did not tolerate. But they created millets for Christians. It was a community, like a county, let's say, where most of the people there are Christians and they're allowed to remain Christian. So the Ottomans tolerated that. They could even live according to their own Christian rules. They had their own Christian holidays, so they were celebrating Christmas and Easter, while a Jewish millet was doing Hanukkah and having bar mitzvahs. So they were allowed inside their millet to retain their own culture. However, they were never able to rise up very high in the government, and they had to pay a religious tax, okay? The jizya. I believe it's spelled like that. It's a religious tax that you had to pay if you weren't a Muslim, and it purchased your religious freedom. This is not offered to polytheists, but that's in any of the textbooks, that religious tax that they paid. So that was kind of a way of accommodating them. And the Ottomans spread by military expansion, and they granted land to the military generals as they expanded, and that meant as long as they were expanding, they were healthy. But when they stopped expanding, they ran out of steam, and that was going to be a problem for the Ottomans. All right. Again, religious art, we looked at that already. The other one is the Qing. The Qing are, they're Manchus, they're people from the steppes, like where the Mongols came from, or a little bit north of that. They're people that the Great Wall is meant to keep out. The Manchus raided the Ming dynasty that we saw over here, that was going on here up until about the 1600s. The Manchus came in, destroyed the Ming, and they set up, once again, foreign rule. The second time China has been ruled by foreign invaders. The first was the Mongols, now it's the Manchu. And they established the Qing dynasty, and this is the last dynasty in Chinese history. And it's also the largest, the most expansive dynasty in Chinese history. So the Manchus, they identified themselves with the Q. It's that looked like a braided ponytail that they wore to differentiate them from other ethnicities. The Chinese hated that. But remember that the Qing used imperial portraiture to legitimize their rule. So when they conquered Mongolia, they would have a picture of the emperor painted riding a horse like a Mongol, and that was meant to show them what the emperor looked like. Remember, this is before TV. No one knew what the emperor looked like. So the emperor was going to show you what he looked like, and he had him painted in a way that would make him seem less foreign to the people he conquered. So for the Chinese, remember, he was not Chinese. He had a picture of him painted in a library with a book. Remember, Confucian scholarship and being academic is what gave legitimacy to Chinese politicians. And then when he conquered Tibet, he had himself painted as a Buddhist to assuage their fears that they're being ruled by someone who doesn't understand our culture. So that is exactly how imperial portraiture was used to strengthen the rule of the Qing. These are all gunpowder empires. Gunpowder was a central part to all of their expansion. So that's kind of a nutshell, some of the bigger elements of the land-based empires that you need to know. The Safavids, there's not a lot about, not a lot about them, as you remember from when you did one of those topic page things. The Safavids were next to the Ottomans. The biggest thing to note about them is that they were Shia Muslims, the Ottomans were Sunni Muslims, and those two empires, look, you could be a Christian in the Ottoman Empire, you could not be a Shia Muslim. They thought that the Shia were extremely dangerous because the Shia were not true Muslims. And so it was very dangerous. To think you're a Muslim but not be one is worse than being a Christian who knows they're not Muslim. And so the Shia and the Ottoman, they battled it out. And there's a very famous battle, the Battle of Chaldiran, where the Ottomans crushed the Shia and Sunni continued to be the dominant form of Islam. Ottomans thought that they had protected the true form of Islam from this disaster of Shiism. Just like the Russians will claim, after Constantinople fell, that Christian city fell, it's on us now. And that's what motivated them to spread their empire and defeat the Mongols who ruled them. So there's a lot going on with these land-based empires here. More details you'll see in your reading, but I think in sketching some big ideas, that's probably a good thing to know. Possible essay topics here: how did land-based empires legitimize their rule? Military elites, gunpowder, they legitimized their rule through art. I gave you some examples. The Russians built St. Basil's Cathedral, or Basilica, to celebrate a victory over the Mongols who had converted to Islam. Another possible essay topic is how did land-based empire building change social structures? And it did, obviously, even if you use maritime empires. The Spanish, it created a whole new structure of castas, all right? Those peninsulares and creoles and mixtures all the way down. A race-based system. In the Mughal Empire, Akbar had to weaken the landed aristocracy. And so they were called zamindars. And I explain on AP Worldopedia how they did that. They just used a tax system that went around them because they used to be the ones who taxed the people, and they kept a lot of it for themselves. So he created a cash system where you pay with cash to the government, not through these landlords, and it just circumvented them and weakened them, and that changed the social structure. The Russians did the same thing to their land-owning elites called the boyars, and just Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, just kind of dismissed them completely. So how empire building changed social structures, and you may have written on that, but those are possible ones. Comparing the maritime empires in North America and South America is a good possibility for an essay. But any essay coming from this time period is going to deal with empires or massive exchanges. Because after Columbus, that entire exchange system that goes on through here is called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, which many essays have been drawn from the Columbian Exchange. There's a lot of things you can ask about it. But, it's diseases coming from Europe going to the Americas. It's religion coming from Europe, Catholicism blending with the indigenous beliefs of Aztecs and other indigenous people. It's pigs and cows and horses brought over, and then it's corn and potatoes and peanuts going to China and Europe. And this whole collective exchange that's just two halves of the world meeting each other and just kind of spreading things around, that's called the Columbian Exchange. Know some examples of things, but what you have going on, the actual economic trade route, which goes from Europe, boats sail to Africa, and from Africa they sail to the Americas, and from Americas they sail back to Africa. This trade route it becomes the most lucrative and most important trade route in this time period. All right? It's called the triangular system, or sometimes it's just called the the Atlantic system. Manufactured goods and guns leave Europe and go to Africa. Those boats are unloaded and traded for slaves. Slaves make that passage called the Middle Passage across to the Americas. They're auctioned there. Sugar, molasses, rum, tobacco is loaded up in the Americas, and those ships go up here to Europe, and the whole thing happens again. It's set up to where a ship never runs empty. It doesn't go sell something, come back empty, load up. It was an economic route, despite the horrible immorality of the slave trade. In the previous time period, the Indian Ocean trade was the most important network. In this time period, it was the Atlantic system, the triangular system of trade. Indian Ocean didn't end, but this became the dominant trade route in the world between 1450 and 1750. And the items that went along with trade and just happened to spread around the world, that is called the Columbian Exchange. So you should know some things about the Columbian Exchange. There's a whole topic page in Unit 4 called the Columbian Exchange. Look how the historical developments are phrased, because that has formed essays, LEQs and DBQs on the AP test. All right, thank you for watching, and I'll do this again for 1750 to 1900.